I'm Josh Knobe from Yale University.
And I'm Lera Boroditsky from Stanford University.
And today we're going to be talking about the relationship between language and thought. So in particular, we're going to be wondering about whether people's language, the language they speak, can actually shape their thoughts, can shape their cognition. So it seems like this has been an issue that's been discussed really not just in contemporary cognitive science, but sort of throughout the history of ideas.
Sure, yeah. Even the greats like Shakespeare have weighed in on it. So in Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare has Juliet say, "What is a rose? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." So in that case, Shakespeare comes down on the side of language, or at least naming, being unimportant. That language doesn't really change how we experience the world. But others have come down on the other side. So, for example, Charlemagne, Holy Roman Emperor, said to have a second language is to have a second soul. Or one of his successors said, "Give me a man who knows 4 languages because he's worth 4 men." So those are pretty strong statements suggesting that actually speaking another language gives you new cognitive powers and even can give you a second soul. Those are some pretty heavy claims.
But you see, it's interesting, if it really were the case that a rose by any other name would really smell just as sweet, then the amount that we spend in advertising budgets, hiring firms to figure out what the rose should be named, would be completely misplaced. It seems like at least the people engaging in this activity think that the rose will actually smell a little bit sweeter if it has just the right name.
Absolutely, that is one of the obvious observations that everyone makes. That if people really didn't think that what things are called mattered, then they would never go around changing the names of things or spend a lot of time trying to come up with just the right name. On the other hand, we have also the opposite intuition that sometimes, especially in cases of political correctness, we feel like, just because you make me call it something else doesn't mean I'll think any differently. I don't understand the point. And so ideas on this topic, arguments for and against, have really gone back and forth. And there's some people who have believed that this is just, this question is absolutely resolved. It's a no-brainer, and the no-brainer answer is language absolutely does not shape thought. And others who have felt just as strongly on the other side, they felt, this is a total no-brainer. It's obvious that language shapes thought, and that's language is even the medium of thought. And so both sides have kind of felt that this question wasn't worth investigating because it was so obvious, except that they came to completely opposite conclusions.
But it seems like the real investigation of this, the current tradition of investigation of this claim, it comes more sort of in the 20th century with these people like Benjamin Lee Whorf, who really began wondering whether this was actually true, or how we might go about figuring out the answer, and so forth.
Yeah, so Whorf, who was working with Sapir, he was working in the late 30s and early 40s. He started by studying a lot of Native American languages, and what he was noticing were really striking differences in how the world was described between English or standard Indo-European languages versus a lot of the languages that he was studying and describing. And as he started noticing these really striking differences, it made him formulate the idea that languages really force you to think of the world a particular way, to construe your world a particular way. And he wrote a lot about that. He proposed a lot of potential differences that could exist between how speakers of different languages think.
So maybe we could talk about some of the major ways in which different languages can differ in how they describe the world.
Sure. So let's say you want to say something even quite simple, like Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. How you would have to say that in different languages would be very different. So in English, if it's something that happened in the past, you say sat rather than sit. But in some languages, like Indonesian or Mandarin, the verb never changes to mark tense. So you'd always use the same form of the verb. In Russian, you would mark tense. You would also, depending on whether it was Mr. Dumpty or Mrs. Dumpty, you would change the verb to indicate the gender of the sitter. In Russian, you would also have to change the verb depending on whether the sitting event was completed in some sense. So if Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall for the entire time that he was meant to do so, then it would be one form of the verb. But if he, say, had a great fall, then you would use a different form of the verb. In Turkish, you would have to report on the verb how you came to know about this event. So if it's something that you yourself witnessed one day, you were walking by the wall and you saw a giant ovoid character sitting there, then you would use one form of the verb. But if you just heard about it or you inferred it from something, you'd use a different form. And these differences go on and on there. And we are just talking about the verb. We're not even talking about the rest of the sentence. And so as people started studying languages, one possible conclusion they were drawing was, hey, look, languages really require very different things from their speakers just in order to be able to speak grammatically. It must be that speakers of different languages think differently. But on the other side, people argued, you know what, just because languages differ doesn't mean people differ in how they think. People could talk differently but think the same way. And here's why that's a possible and a very reasonable hypothesis. Whenever we talk, we're really only describing a very small proportion of what we know. So if I tell you it's raining today, it happens not to be raining. It's beautiful in San Francisco. But if I say it's raining today, I don't have to say it's raining outside. You don't think, oh boy, Lera doesn't know if it's raining inside or outside because all she said was it's raining. You assume that I know a lot more than I'm actually putting into any particular thing that I say. And so you could say, well, languages differ a whole lot in what they ask their speakers to talk about, but that doesn't mean people don't notice all those things, don't pay attention to all the same things, and don't remember the same things.
Yeah, so on the contrary, when I was first being introduced to cognitive science, people often had the idea that this old Worfian idea was completely mistaken, and they often would say that people have a certain ability to talk about certain things and articulate them in language, but that their actual cognition far, far outstrips that. So the vast majority of the way that people understand the world is sort of completely unconscious, not something that they're able to articulate in language, that the aspect of their understanding they're able to actually speak about is just this little extra thing on the top. So that if we change the way people were talking, we could have only the most minor kind of insignificant impact on how people's real understanding of the world worked.
Right. And it's certainly true that our cognitive capacities are in lots of ways much more detailed, much more expressive internally than what can be captured in many human languages. We can create really vivid mental images, and a lot of great human achievements are reported to have happened in mental imagery. So, for example, Einstein says that the way he came up with a lot of his insights was to get a mental image. So he would get a mental image of himself riding on a beam of light, and only later would he translate these things into language or into mathematics. So absolutely, we have lots of other cognitive capacities. What we have learned, though, in the last 30 or 40 years in cognitive science is that even though our cognitive capacities are pretty impressive, there are lots of things that we get wrong, and we don't see the world nearly as completely or as truly as we really think we do. And in the case of attention, for example, we can really only attend to a few things at a time, even though we have this illusion that we're seeing the world in rich colors and great detail. There's been a slew of ingenious experiments showing that actually that's just an illusion. We're just fooling ourselves to think that we're perceiving the world so completely. So I think that again...
But, you know, it's interesting. It's interesting about that you could actually see that very point going in either of two directions. So the Worfian could take comfort in that thought, thinking, well, we can attend to so little and we're completely mistaken about what we're attending to, so maybe we're actually only attending to the things that we can articulate in language. But the anti-Worfian could say, what people think they're attending to is the stuff that they're mentioning in language, but they're actually these very complex things that they're actually attending to that they just are completely unaware that they're attending to on any level. So it might be thought initially that all of these data suggesting that people are completely wrong about how their minds work point to how little of an impact you should expect the stuff that we're able to linguistically express to have on our underlying sort of cognitive capacities.
I think what it does is it opens the question again as an empirical question, right? So in order for language to meaningfully shape thought, two things have to be true. One is languages have to really differ from one another, right? If languages don't show any differences, then the point is moot. Languages do really differ from one another, so that side is okay. The other side that has to be true is that cognition has to be flexible and there has to be room for change. People have to be able to change with experience. If our cognition was entirely fixed, if there's nothing that we could change about it, then again, the question would be moot, right? And so as soon as you start finding that our perception of the world is incomplete, our memory is not perfect, the kinds of things we attend to can really shift with experience, all of those findings help reopen the question as an empirical question. So it really becomes a question, does it and do languages really shape the way people think? Can we find any evidence for this really being the case?
And you've been one of the major forces in these past few years showing that there is such evidence. So maybe you could tell us about some of the exciting findings that are coming out of your lab in that direction.
Sure. So one favorite and very classic question is about how we perceive colors. So languages differ very much in how they describe colors. So in English, we have many color words. In some languages, there are only two, so words like light and dark. In some languages, there are 5. In some languages, there are 7. And in some languages, there are more basic terms for colors than there are in English. So there's quite a bit of variability. There are also some similarities across languages. So there seems to be structured variability. But nonetheless, languages really differ from one another. So old question is, does that mean that speakers of different languages actually perceive colors differently? Are there real consequences for perception? One reason this question has been so sexy over the years is that color perception seems like such a low-level part of cognition, that it's really one of the first processing steps into the entire cognitive system. And if you find an effect of language, even in this very early set of processing steps, that's very exciting because that means there could be consequences all the way down the line in the cognitive stream. So one example we've looked at, for example, is the difference between English and Russian. So in Russian, there are 2 words for blue. Instead of one word that covers the entire spectrum that English speakers call blue, there's a word for light blue, голубой, and there's a word for dark blue, синий. And these are as unrelated to one another as orange and yellow in English. So they're completely different words. And so the question we asked, if you show Russian speakers 2 colors, one is голубой, one is синий, will they actually perceive those colors to be more different from one another than an English speaker would think? Because for an English speaker, they're both blue. They're the same color, essentially. So we did some experiments to find out whether there are indeed differences in color discrimination. So we asked people to make decisions on looking at color patches and making decisions about what's the same and what's different very, very quickly. And what we find is actually exactly what language would predict. In cases where, for Russian speakers, there is a linguistic distinction, they were faster than in cases where there wasn't. And for English speakers, there is no difference because there is no linguistic distinction.
These data are amazing. But then someone could say, in response to that type of experiment, that all you're showing is just a correlation, but it's unclear which way the causal direction goes. So it could be that there's something about Russian culture such that they make this distinction, and that's why the distinction shows up in their language. as opposed to that there's a difference in our language, and that's why people of that culture make the distinction.
That's an excellent point, and it's actually a problem for all research comparing speakers of different languages, because all cross-linguistic research violates the basic fundamental assumption of what an experiment should be. So in any science, regardless of whether you're doing psychology or plant biology, whatever it is, you're supposed to, for a real good experiment, you're supposed to bring your participants in, randomly divide them into two groups, apply some treatment to one group and different treatment to another group, and then see if there are differences in outcomes. So logically, what that would mean for a cross-linguistic study is you would have to bring people into the lab, randomly assign them to be Russian speakers or English speakers, then see if that makes a difference. Now, of course, that doesn't work, right? I can't bring people into the lab and randomly assign them to be Russian or English speakers.
But maybe there's something you could just teach people particular color words.
Oh, well, that's exactly what people have done. So that's exactly what people ended up doing. So in studies where people are taught new linguistic distinctions between colors, their performance on categorical perception does change. So you can show that even with a very, very brief training, trying to learn to distinguish new color samples, you'll get better at making certain discriminations just by virtue of talking about them differently.
But I think one of the things that was most impressive is your work where you sort of prevent them from thinking linguistically.
So that gets at the question of how language shapes color perception in this case. One possibility is that speaking a language has really rewired the perceptual system so that when you look at colors, you don't have to name them, you don't have to have access to any of your linguistic abilities. They will just be processed differently, right? Very low-level rewiring. Another possibility is that language actually comes in and meddles online as you're doing a task, even though you don't need language to do these kinds of tasks. In the tasks, all people are doing is looking at color squares and pressing buttons as fast as they can. They're very simple tasks. They're, the kinds of tasks that pigeons can do. So we know that language isn't necessary for the task. But what we do find is, surprisingly, even though you don't need language at all, people do seem to use it. People do activate their linguistic ideas. And the way we know that is if you take people's ability to use language away. So in this case, we give them another verbal task to do, a distracting verbal task. So they repeat numbers as they're making their color decisions. Doing that wipes out the cross-linguistic differences that we see. So Russian speakers are no longer discriminating faster between their two blues when their verbal loop is already tied up. So that suggests that what language was doing, quite surprisingly, is coming in and trying to meddle in this low-level perceptual process right as it was happening. This study and a lot of other studies that have found similar results, both in color and lots of other domains, have recently really changed what we think is included in what we used to call thinking or what we used to call perception, right? Before, no one would look at a color task like that and say, oh boy, that's a linguistic task. It just looked like a basic perceptual task. But what we're finding is that actually humans, adult humans who speak languages, really love to use language for all kinds of tasks, even when you don't expect them, you don't require them to do it. So many more tasks appear to use language than we ever thought before.
So from the way you describe the results, it almost seems as though there are two distinct mechanisms by which we can categorize things in colors. One mechanism that gets knocked out when you're unable to use language, and then another mechanism that's still preserved. So really, it almost looks like there are two different abilities we have, or two very different processes that are separable in some way.
In this case, it does seem that way. So it seems probably the most likely case is that language is interfering at the perceptual decision stage. So information both from the linguistic system and from the perceptual system is being input into the perceptual decision. And so how fast people can make that perceptual decision depends on whether information from language is useful or not useful. In the case of English, and looking at all these different blues, the information from language will never be useful because it'll never be able to distinguish the colors. All the colors will be blue. But in the case of Russian, sometimes it will be useful.
So far we've just been talking about this one example, the example of language. But one of the cases in your work that I found most striking is the case of gender. So the different ways in which different languages use gender. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So one reason I was really interested in this case is rather than looking at something like color where it seems cool because it's so early, but at the same time, it's so specific. And some people might even say, you know what, who cares about color? You can be colorblind and lead a perfectly happy life. Maybe color is just not that important. And so I wanted to look at something where the effects could potentially be very broad, very pervasive. And one really good place to find things like that in language are grammatical differences. So some kind of grammatical feature that attaches to all nouns, for example. And grammatical gender is one such feature. So in languages like Spanish, all nouns are divided into two categories. There's masculine and feminine. And all things that are biologically male are in the grammatically masculine category. But also a whole bunch of other things. You know, half of all inanimate objects and abstract entities also are grammatically masculine, and the other half are feminine. And so what we want to know is, does this assignment, this grammatical gender assignment, which seems so arbitrary and so meaningless, do people actually end up taking something meaningful from it, even though maybe they shouldn't? So conveniently, this is another case where languages really differ from one another. So the sun, for example, is I've forgotten the gender assignment now.
So in Spanish, for example, it would be masculine.
In Spanish, it would be masculine. In German, it would be feminine. In Russian, it would be neuter. And so the question for us was, does that mean that speakers of these languages actually start thinking of the sun or the moon or all the other abstract things as actually having male-like or female-like properties? So here's one example of a study. You bring people into the lab and you ask them to rate properties that could be masculine or feminine, or generate descriptions. Give me 3 adjectives to describe an object. When German and Spanish speakers were asked to do this, they came up with descriptions, grammatical adjective descriptions that had this gender valence that was consistent with the grammatical gender in their language. We picked objects for which the grammatical genders were opposite to one another in the two languages. And so for describing a bridge, for example, which is feminine in German speakers would often use adjectives like beautiful or extended or fragile, and Spanish speakers would often say things like strong, and towering, and long, suggesting that the first set of associations they had for these objects actually were quite different to one another.
So I wonder about this effect that you just described. Would this go away if people weren't able to use language online? So what if people were engaged in some other task that made them unable to think in Spanish, in English, and Russian, but then they're just thinking about the sun? Would they end up thinking about it in a different way?
So in one set of studies, we tried to get at that. It wasn't a study where you were generating adjectives. Instead, it was a similarity rating task. People were looking at pictures and rating similarity between pairs of pictures. And at the same time, we gave them a verbal interference task, something that would make it difficult for them to access linguistic information. And quite different from the color case, in this case, we didn't find that the verbal interference changed the effects. So Spanish and German speakers were still rating similarity in a way that was consistent with grammatical gender in their language, even though they didn't have access to that grammatical information. And what that suggests to me is that the representations of objects in people's minds actually had changed, that they had actually grown grown to be different underlying representations. It wasn't that language was meddling online. Instead, it had changed what you had stored in memory. And
so then it seems like, oh, sorry.
Sorry. I was going to say that one fun way to see this, this is an effect you can see with your own eyes if you go to an art gallery and ask yourself, in personifications or in allegories, how do artists figure out if they're going to paint time or death or sin as a man or as a woman? One thing you'll see is that depending on the grammatical gender of sin or death or time in the artist's native language, they'll quite consistently make that decision. So you can see Father Time, and you can see Lady Liberty and Lady Justice, and so on. These are things that have become concrete objects in our culture that, you know, in the same way that I think language shapes the hidden representations in our minds, it also seems to shape these very visible, very solid representations out in culture.
So if people wanted to change the attitude that people have, say, toward the police, if they could just introduce a new word for police that had a different grammatical gender, maybe they would really, truly have an impact in whether people saw the police as nurturing and protecting and helpful versus scary and malevolent and sort of intimidating.
Well, I'm not sure that positive and negative traits divide so cleanly across the genders. I'm not sure that all masculine traits are bad. For example.
I wasn't trying to suggest that. I just meant in that particular case.
I think what happens is a principled integration. So for each particular object or entity, you take the salient features that it, let's say you think of the sun. How is the sun similar to a stereotype of a man, right? A stereotypical idea of masculinity. Well, the sun is powerful, and maybe it's unforgiving. And you can come up with ways that the sun is similar to the stereotype of maleness. Or you could say, well, how is the sun similar to femaleness? And instead you could say, well, it's nurturing and it's warm. And it gives us all the plants that provide food, and it brings light and happiness and so on. And so, but those are not the same features that you would pick out if you were trying to think of what's masculine about a table or what's masculine about a flower, right? In each of those cases, you would come up with a very different set of features, because the idea of masculinity for us is also very complex. It has many, many different aspects to it, and the idea of femininity as well. So in fact, in lots of follow-up studies that I won't tell you all about, but what we find is support exactly for this nuanced view that what people are doing is not simply selecting one set of stereotype features, but for each object, they're kind of figuring out, if this thing were similar to a male or a female, what are the features of this object that I would have to make more salient? What's the principled integration of the features of this object and the idea of masculinity? And so you get this kind of more nuanced, more subtle, very individualized approach to how each object becomes more masculine or more feminine.
So, and have you tried not only looking at languages that just naturally differ in their classifications, but bringing people into the lab and introducing new conceptual classifications that they have to do by your instruction? Yes.
So we did exactly that once. We brought people in and we taught them this language we made up in the lab called Gumbuzi. And in Gumbuzi, we told our participants there is an usitive-supative distinction. And our participants are psychology students, so they believe that there are things named usitive and supative because they've heard linguists talk this way before. And so they're like, okay, linguists have funny words. So what it means for something to be usitive or supative in Gumbuzi is you say us before usitive things, and you say su before supative things. It's like there are two different words for that. And so we bring people in, we teach half of them one set of gender assignments, teach the other half the opposite set. And then we can test them on all the same tasks that you can test speakers of Spanish or German or Russian. And what we find is learning to speak Gumbuzi in this way, learning the grammatical gender assignments in Gumbuzi, has the same effect as we see with people who naturally speak languages grammatical gender. That suggests that just learning those grammatical assignments actually can have the important effects that we're seeing with natural language.
And it also suggests that the problems that we might run into because of our natural language aren't, as it were, fixed. It's not that because I've been speaking this language for the past 30-something years, I'm somehow stuck and can't get out of it. But even just bringing people into the lab and teaching them something for the brief time that they're in the lab, they were able to really change their way of thinking in some way. It makes it seem like there's hope for us, that if our language is doing things to us that we might not be happy about, in very brief periods of time we can change that.
We can change it, we can change it, and importantly, in order to make the change permanent or to make the change last, we have to keep practicing it, right? So in natural language, we're constantly being given new things, new ways of expressing the grammatical ideas over and over and over again. So in a language like Russian, grammatical gender is an incredibly pervasive feature. In every sentence, you're going to have to make the adjectives and the verbs and the number words and the possessives. Everything has to agree with the grammatical gender of the noun. So you're just constantly practicing it. It's a very strong habit in language that creates a habit in thought. And so if we learn new things, we can learn new things. Some new things that we can learn them very easily. But in order for them to really stick, we have to keep practicing them.
Maybe a really nice example of this is the research that you guys have been doing about number and the significance of number words, which we're endlessly practicing and seem really to influence our thought about numerical questions.
Yeah, so in number, I think, is another really wonderful example. So the basic case in number is some languages don't have number words. So the Piraha, this is a language group that was studied extensively by Dan Everett, and the first report of number competence in this group was done by Peter Gordon. The Piraha don't have exact number words, so they have words like few or many, but they don't have words like 7 or 13, which we do in English. And there are lots of languages like this around the world. Some languages might have a word for 1 or 2, and then they go to few and many, and so on. And so the observations so far, and all the work that people have done, boils down to this. If you have number words in your language, like in English, chances are very good, not exactly 100%, but pretty close to 100%, that you will be able to count and you will be able to keep track of exact numbers. If your language doesn't have number words, chances are pretty good, again, not 100%, but chances are pretty good that you won't be able to count, that you won't be able to keep track of exact quantities. There are some exceptions, but the general rule is really striking, a really striking difference. Now, if you have number words and you're able to count, then you can develop further bits of mathematics, right? You can build on that knowledge. So you can then build algebra, and then eventually you can solve differential equations, and you can calculate the trajectory that would be optimal for landing a rocket on a comet 14 years from launch, right? I mean, we can do incredibly complicated things now, but they all have to start somewhere. They have to start with the basic of, can you count? Can you keep track of 7 as opposed to 13? And so this is a case where people quite often around the world rely on language, specifically rely on words in order to be able to have basic mathematical competence. And you can see this even in very smart folks. So, for example, a study by Michael Frank at MIT, he took MIT students. Now, these folks are pretty smart folks. They can count at the very least. But if you ask them to, so he would show them bunches of dots on a screen and ask them to say how many there were. if at the same time as they had to do this simple counting task, he gave them a verbal interference, a verbal shadowing task, their ability to count completely fell apart. They couldn't do it. And instead, they had to revert to a much simpler system, which a cognitive system that we share with rats and other non-human animals, which is just kind of an analog system that gives you an approximate answer of how many things there are. But they couldn't keep track of the exact numbers. Mm-hmm. That suggests that, at least for American English speakers, the way they do counting and exact numerical operations seems to really have that in language. But I want to go ahead.
This seems like a really interesting aspect of the way that we think about number. But I wonder if we should think of this as a window somehow into how we think more generally, or whether we should think there's really something quite special going on with number in particular. So if I had been thinking instead not about the number of objects, but say about the gender of those objects, mm-hmm. maybe I wouldn't need in any way to be thinking in any natural language. I could just think about the gender. Or if I need to be thinking about where they were within a room, maybe I could do that without thinking in language. So are you thinking that this thing about number is somehow telling us how number is different from other aspects of cognition, or revealing something that will turn out to be much more general and not apply to number in particular?
I think it's something that we've seen in other cases. So in the case of color, we also saw that verbal interference changed people's behavior. And in lots of other cases, people have seen that when people are not able to talk in the moment or not able to access language in the moment, their performance changes. You know, humans are so smart and so sophisticated and so complicated that we figured out all kinds of ways to solve different problems. So even in the case of number, even though for most of us, the solution is in terms of number words and in terms of using language, there are other solutions, and some people have implemented them. So, for example, if you learn to use the abacus, that gives you a visual representation of number. And there are kids, so for example, this isn't more work by Michael Frank. He studied these kids who learn not just the abacus, but also the mental abacus, where in their minds they imagine the abacus and they imagine moving beads. And they can do amazing mathematical operations using these mental images of an abacus. And for them, if you give them verbal interference while they're doing this, it doesn't change their performance at all. It doesn't interfere. So they found a different way to use their mind to solve this complex number, this complex number task. So I think there's quite a bit of flexibility. It is the case that almost everywhere around the world, the way people have solved the task of how do you keep track of exact numbers has included words. But I don't think it necessarily has to be that. Words are certainly extremely useful. It's a really great tool, and we love using them. But I think it isn't right to say that that's the only way that we can do it.
You know, so maybe the case of color and the case of number are actually really similar in a way. That it's that we have an ability to keep track of colors just by using color words. Mm-hmm. And then we also have some other ability to keep track of color that doesn't involve color words. And similarly with number, we have an ability to keep track of numbers using number words or just using the analog magnitude system. And then the reason these seem so different is because our analog magnitude system can't do anything even remotely similar to the ability we would have to keep track of, for example, the exact number of 5,204. Mm-hmm. But our ability to keep track of colors using a system that doesn't involve words is itself very complex and can make pretty fine gradations among colors.
In the case of number, we build on that basic knowledge. We build on the basic ability to count and keep track of quantities in very impressive ways. So not only do we know how to count, but then later we know how to multiply and how to divide and how to integrate. And all of those ideas are built, they're premised on the idea that you would have number words to start. In the case of color, I'm not sure how much more we do with the information. It's very important to us to know what the world looks like, and it brings a lot of joy to have that information, to be able to see all the rich colors. But there isn't the same structuring on top of the knowledge system. Whereas in the case of number, it really opens the window to a whole host of new cognitive abilities that you couldn't have otherwise. So I think it's
so maybe it's actually
it's just a more transformative change because it's kind of, it really allows you a whole new world of cognitive abilities.
So maybe it's really that for each domain of human experience, we have these different systems, one which is sort of non-linguistic and one which is linguistic. We could keep track of genders by using words like woman and man, or in a way that doesn't involve language. But what's special about number is not that there are these two separate systems, but that one of the systems, the linguistic system, has become the foundation of something so beautiful and complex, in a way that our ability to keep track of genders using gender words hasn't been at the root of an incredibly beautiful and complex system by which we can accomplish so much more than we could accomplish if we kept track of people's genders in another way.
Yeah, definitely some ideas in language are much better than others. Some lead to many more exciting things down the line than others. But all of these things are ways that we construct our worlds and ways that we make meaning. So gender, for example, whether you think of a table as masculine or feminine, may not matter that much in your practical life. It may matter a little bit. But if you think about how many things are marked by gender, so in a language that has grammatical gender, everything that's named by a noun has a gender. And so as you look around the world, well, think about all the things that can be named by nouns. It's just about everything. That means it's really coloring this whole way that you have of looking. Everything that you see is shaded by these subtleties of the language that you speak, complete quirks of the language that you speak. So it's a very different kind of effect in the one case. In the gender case, I think it's a kind of broad, pervasive effect. In the case of number, I think it's a transformative effect. It changes one domain of cognition, but it changes it drastically. It really transforms it. They're important and interesting for very different reasons.
So we began by thinking about this sort of broad humanistic question that led us to all of this science, this question that was dividing, say, Shakespeare from Charlemagne. So now that we've sort of gone through all these studies, do you think that we can gain some broad humanistic insight which will allow us to have a deeper appreciation of these sort of age-old questions?
Absolutely. So for one thing, I think what we've discovered is that language is much more a part of the cognitive system than we ever before thought, scientifically, that we ever before thought. That adult humans are constantly relying on the structures in language to make sense of their world and make sense of the experiences that they're having. Another thing that we've learned is that when we think about the big questions, how do we come to be the way we are? Or why do I think the way I do? All of us wonder those things, right? And these questions of does language shape thought, really, the reason they've always been so controversial and such hot topics is that they really tie into this question of what is the origin of our knowledge and why do we think the way that we do? I mean, that's a big question that everyone wants to know an answer to. And in this case, because it's language is such a essentially human thing, right? Language is something that only humans have in the richness that we have it. It almost seems like language is the human essence. That's what being human is all about. And so if you find that speakers of different languages are actually seeing the world differently, constructing different ideas of the world, that almost suggests that maybe we have the ability to build very different human essences, right? We have very different ways of constructing the world, that we could think of it this way, we could think of it that way. But most of us throughout our lives will never have to think of the world differently than we normally do, because we don't have the occasion to go learn another language or learn to shift frame for some other reason. But it's exciting for me to think about what are all the other ways of construing our world? What are all the ways that we could think about it that we haven't thought about it yet?
So in the future, maybe we will be able to create new languages that will enable us to think about the world in new ways that we couldn't even imagine at this point.
That's absolutely possible. I mean, the idea of numbers is a relatively recent human invention. That's a case where it took people a very long time to start developing number words and the idea of number. And eventually, when they got developed several different places around the world, and they spread, and it's been transformative. And so it's completely not out of the question that we could have more ideas like that someone right now is developing some new way of talking that will make it possible for us to have some completely unpredictable and marvelous cognitive ability.
So, well, on this optimistic note, Lera Boroditsky, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Josh. It's been really fun.
Bye-bye.
Bye.